For those of you who don't know me, I'm Barbara Porter, and tonight I have two hats. Obviously, as director, I'm welcoming you to this evening. We're very privileged to have the Acting Director General of Antiquities, Yazid Alian, here and some of his staff. We have Dr. Suleiman Farajat from the Petra Park, the PDTRA, and 8 people from Petra have come up just for this lecture. And of course, in this room are people who've known about this project for a long, long time. Last night I saw many people and I talked about it and they said, yes, I remember when the papyri were found, which of course was December 1993, 25 years ago. So I'm now going to tell you the story of how some of these books were created, and then what will happen is the more scholarly presentations by Jaakko and Antti will follow. So this truly is, for me, a very special evening. Since I became director in 2006, ever since then, the responsibility of helping coordinate the production part of these volumes has been mine. And so I took this on, I would say, certainly not lightly. I don't think any of us thought in 2007, when volume, at that point, 3 came out, that it would take quite so long. So I'm going to make things quickly because others will be showing some of these images, but not all of you have seen how they were found in December 1993. Spig Fiema, the excavator, is there in the lower left. Kathy Valentour, the conservator, is working there on them on her hands and knees. And many of these same people are still involved right now in the process in protecting the Petra Church, which of course is under the authority of the Department of Antiquities and the PDTRA. They found them in December 1993. They splashed around the world in various ways in newsprint and CNN, BBC. But of course, ACOR's job was also then to make sure that it was published in our newsletter. We're very happy to see our board member Bert de Vries here, who when he was director started the newsletter in 1989, and it's continued to be a mechanism for us to make these special reports of what has happened. And so here, who do you see? That's the image, of course, you have from our flyer that was created by Starling Carter, our wonderful development assistant. And here you see Jaakko at the top. But the first article was written by Glenn Peterman, who was then the assistant director, and he's there with Spig Fiema. I love these old pictures because it shows me that's my office with Jaakko now. So things keep changing around. In the 1990s, ACOR was a very busy place with the papyri, and again, Antti and Jaakko will be telling parts of the end part of the story. But Ludwig Koenen of the University of Michigan, who you see on the upper left with Trajanos Gagos, he was part of the original people working on these scrolls. They were divided in a certain way, and people from Michigan, particularly Trajanos, came coming on a regular basis. And the Finnish team has been the largest long-term and large number of presence. So here are some images that show you on the lower left, Patricia Bakai bringing a group in with 3 of the Finnish specialists working with the papyri. There you see on the right, lower right, that team from Brigham Young University that brought the special scanning equipment to do the photography in 1998. And one of the people who had the privilege, and I'm sure she would say the same, of both excavating and conserving the mosaics on site at the Petra Church, and then coming and helping with the whole conservation, is Fatma Mari, who of course many of you know well. She's in this room in the back taking pictures, and Fatma is now of course a professor at the University of Jordan in conservation. And we're going to have her write her story someday. This actually is my favorite picture from the archives. It is not the real scroll. You could not do that. It was a very long scroll, but they did a mock-up at the time in 1996, and you can see Jaakko on the right, and many of the other the wonderful scholars that are represented here are still involved, and you'll see their names on many of the books. As I've said before, it's not my story in terms of the discovery because it happened in 1993. Trying to figure out the whole project was in the 90s. But also to understand the context, you have to go read the Petra Church book, which I'm sure many of you read cover to cover. I often say I've read it 6 times cover to cover. These I've only read 2 times cover to cover. As the proofreader, as the person who wants to make sure there's no one last mistake, these show you the 5 volumes. The first, I want to mention that Andrea Talla was the designer of the cover. She's also the wonderful designer of our wonderful 50th logo that was on my first image. And in terms of the layout, the first volume was to Patricia Bekai and Mario Leitinen, who spent a lot of time at ACOR as a scholar working on this material. And we've been very lucky to have Isabel Rubin, who does up till now has done our newsletter, also be the layout person for volumes 2 through 5. So this is Maria, who I didn't know because I only came here in 2006, and sadly she died in 2003. But volume 3 is dedicated to her, and even in this last volume, many of the sections were things that show her scholarship that still lives on 15 years after her death. Now, other people, and this is now more, these are my photos, where everybody now knows Barbara likes to take photos. Luckily, I also know how to find them. So when I was trying to figure out what to show, I wanted to show the hard work that these scholars have undertaken. This is just showing them when they're here. But remember, back home, they're spending endless hours of their weekend time. So here you see Marit and Jorma Cameo, who've been coming back many times. I could have shown them sunning themselves on the patio, because everybody from Finland loves to come to Jordan for the sun, especially at this time of year. But they actually spent endless hours, again, in whatever space we gave them at that time. In 2007, it was the computer room, which of course is the space, the auxiliary space where people are sitting right now. Jaakko came with a tour group in March of 2008. We're very fortunate he has a tour group with us tonight, 30 people from his group. And I have to admit that that particular time, the joke was on me. It was a Friday, and he's the only one who I will willingly say, yes, you can bring your group on Friday. I'll make everything available to you. I was so excited to hear him talk, and then didn't realize, of course, he's speaking in Finnish. It didn't do me any good at all. So I had to wait 10 years to have tonight happen to hear him speak in English. Another wonderful person in the process was Traiano Gagos, who you see being a scholar in one of our carols that's off to the side. But he also was, every summer that he came, he lit up our lives. This happens to be him on his birthday, his 48th birthday. Sadly, he died before he was 50, and he leaves a hole in our heart to this day. But we can remember him at the 40th anniversary of ACOR, after the fact, doing the Depke or the Greek equivalent and trying to teach all these young people to do that. Now, Jaakko came back in September 2008 to turn over the double-sided papyrus. I will let him tell you the agony of doing that. Every time I see these photographs, I think, what does it take to turn over each little piece of papyrus? I don't even want to think about it. I don't even want to think about how they opened them all, because it's such an amazing task. But they also, of course, there's photography behind everything. There was the original photography, various other stages, but then Jan Vehonen and others came to help do new photography that would be for the future publications. So then I have this cavalcade of pictures of Antti and then his colleague Matthias Buchholz coming to ACOR, spending usually a few weeks working on the next volumes. So here you see them in March of 2009, and then they came back in March of 2010. Obviously, at that point, Matthias had let his hair grow a little longer, so he looks a little different. But this is painstaking work, and at that time, when they come here, there are still eureka moments where they're looking at a line and they'd always thought they understood exactly what was being done or what was read, and they said, oh, well, actually, maybe, what do you think about this idea? Behind every scholarly endeavor of parsing out every little word and meaning are, of course, the production part. Isabel Rubin has been a colleague and a close associate on our publications. So here you see her. I bribe her in the afternoon with lapsang souchong tea, and then we keep working and working and working. And then finally, after all her layout work, we go to the press together and we look at the documents coming off the press. Now, these documents, as you'll see, certainly are still here at ACOR, but here you see colleagues from the Jordan Museum, some of who are in this audience. At that time, Fatma was there with conservation, and the curator, Jebel Haroun, with his colleague Gosha, because one of these documents, and you can all go down to the Jordan Museum, it's now been reopened, and see for yourself in a niche this whole document that is actually dedicated to King Hussein. And after it was published in volume 4, it was the perfect time to turn it over to the department. But that means, as you see Mohammed Shobaki and Yosha, paperwork. So they didn't have to go back to Petra, but the people from Petra had to come here and sign off with the Department of Antiquities and the people down in Petra that these were now going to be turned over. And there were 18 glass plates that we packed up and they took there and now are there on display. This point, in November 2014, Antti came, and he doesn't look quite as happy. I think he's saying, I don't really want to come here again unless it's a party. So here I am once more checking these details. But this is, again, and I think they'll reinforce how important it is to come here and look at these things. Their colleague, Maria Vierosh, also came shortly thereafter, and she's the one who wrote in this last volume 5, The Greek of the Petra Papyri, and it's a wonderful essay, which I hope all of you who are interested in this period will take a chance to read. And then a newcomer to the project was Ahmed Al-Jalad, whose specialty is early Arabic. He helped on volume 2, but in volume 5 is a lasting essay on the Arabic of the Petra Papyri, because many of you know in this audience that although it's written in Byzantine Greek or Greek of the Byzantine period, it shows that they're certainly speaking a form of Arabic, and I'm sure that will be referenced later. So where are the papyri? They're in a special storeroom downstairs on the left. When the time comes, there's a special place within the Department of Antiquities or the Jordan Museum, which is climate controlled. All of them will be turned over there because our job is done. There's more work to be done in the future. Somebody will go other places to study, but really the job has been finished. But it was fun to watch Ahmed for the first time. He'd worked on them by photographs. So this is the first time he had a chance to actually see them in person. So June 10th of this year, it's my birthday. It was my 65th birthday. The biggest present of all was the final proofs of this volume. And there Isabel and I, and unfortunately even then we found 2 things we had to fix, but they can be fixed by the national press, and they were. And so then what does it mean? I then go to the national press 2 full days. I watch every single plate come out. I sign off on each one, each signature, and there you see the master printer Iyad checking things out with his print proofer Marwan. And I'm at that time having the privilege of coming back to look again at this version. And where am I sitting when I'm at the national press, going back and forth to the lower floor? I'm in the office of Omar Zaman, who we hoped would come tonight, but he's got a big project, so he probably isn't going to make it. But he is the one who, in my whole time since 2007, has helped us shepherd these through. This box set he designed. And so the final thing about the Petra Papyri is the full set weighs 12.5 kilograms. It's 1,212 pages of text, 363 plates, and a total of 1,575 pages. People like outcomes or outputs or whatever you want to call it. I just call it a lot of hard work over a long period of time. And in terms of tonight, of course, we've talked about the papyri, but Jaakko and his colleagues also worked up at Jebel Haroun. And one of the privileges of being director of ACOR, you get to visit the sites. So here's Jaakko receiving Fauzi Zayedin and Chris Tuttle and myself. And so now I'm going to turn it over first to Jaakko to tell further the real story. But I really want to say I thank you to all the people who helped make this possible, and 2 of them who are central to the story, who've been the editors and been patient, are here, and we should be very grateful that they were able to arrange to be with us tonight. Thank you very much.
Distinguished colleagues, dear friends, as Barbara told you, in 1993, carbonized remains of papyrus scrolls were discovered during the American excavations of the Byzantine Church. It was probably symptomatic that it happened to be on December 6, which is the Independence Day of Finland. The archaeologists, headed by Dr. Zbigniew Fiema, American archaeologist of Polish origin, didn't know what to do with that kind of extremely fragile or organic material. And the rainy season, which was very late that year, was liable to start at any moment. Therefore, they looked for help from the States, starting with their colleagues, the historians. Shaking their heads, they said, "That's a mission impossible. We have never seen that kind of material, but why don't you ask the papyrologist at Ann Arbor, Michigan?" so they did. In Ann Arbor, they said, sure, we know a lot about papyri, but in our collections we don't possess any burnt papyri, and our conservators never worked on that kind of material. But we know that at University of Helsinki in Finland, there are some silly Finns who have been working on carbonized papyri and who also opened that kind of scrolls. That's true. For more than 10 years, I had been working on similar material found in the 1960s in Egypt, in the city of Bubastos, nowadays Tel Basta or Zagatzig, in the eastern Nile Delta, and housed in the collections of Vienna, Cologne, Athens, Barcelona, that time in Trieste, and Duke University. 3 years I had, for the first time, the opportunity to see the originals also at Duke. In 1996, so it was already Christmas Eve when the DHL courier knocked my door and gave me an envelope from Amman. I had never been in Jordan and I didn't know anybody in Amman. So I joked about a Christmas present from an unknown admirer. Actually, it really was a Christmas present, but from Ludwig Köhnen, professor of Greek and papyrology at the University of Michigan. I met him several times when I was working on the carbonized papyri of Bubastos in Cologne in 1984. Now, as soon as possible, I had to take a flight to Amman, and I came for the first time in February next year, 1994. And I saw the carbonized papyri of Petra. You probably can imagine how totally disappointed I was. What I saw was a mess of black charcoal. In most cases, the outer windings of the scrolls were destroyed. Anyhow, the core was preserved in many cases, sometimes containing the beginning of the roll with the date. This happened in case the last reader didn't re-roll the scroll back to the beginning of the document. Well, they were sharp papyri, but not like the nice pieces of carbonized scrolls from Bubastos or those literary scrolls from Herculaneum. At any rate, I was in Amman, and I had to try to open some scrolls and to have the written records, and I succeeded. I was able to read the first Greek words which made part of the dating of a document and some personal names too. The papyri were clearly legal and economic documents and made part of an archive or dossier, probably a family archive. From the 6th century AD, so they were from the 6th century AD. The personal names were mostly Greek, but among them there were also Nabatean names written in Greek letters. That was the second sensation. For the past 2 centuries, since Petra was rediscovered by John Louis Burckhardt in 1812, scholars had assumed that Petra, the ancient splendid caravan city of the Arabs called Nabateans, was destroyed by a severe earthquake already in 363 and was never rebuilt. The Nabateans disappeared from Transjordan and Palestine, they said. That's why Christianity never reached Petra, which remained a pagan and later on a heretical village. That small village was totally destroyed by another earthquake in 551, as they said. But today, several large churches have already been excavated in Petra, all of them built after the earthquake of 363. And now we have at hand an archive of legal and economic documents containing lots of information about people, their buildings and landed property, without any marks of a big change in the economic situation. Since the earliest dated document from 537 until the latest one from 593. It means that until the end of the 6th century, Petra remained a prosperous city, the metropolis of the Nabateans, now of the Christianized Nabateans, even in the long eastern land routes of the caravans were at least partially substituted by seaborne trade. Petra is called in those documents the imperial Antonine colony, distinguished and native mother of colonies, Hadrianic Petra, metropolis of the Palestina Tertia Salutaris. In Greek we are en Augustokolonia, Antoniane episemo, kai engenei, metrikolonion, Hadriane Petra, metropolites trites Palestines salutarias. Not more, nothing less. At the crossing point of several important caravan routes, there still was in the 6th century a stopover for caravans in Petra, using the attractive city and its hinterland as a place of recreation. There was water enough, and there still was a collecting and irrigation system which was needed for the maintenance of agricultural productivity. The Mediterranean port of the city was Gaza, where one of the carbonized documents had been written, P. Petra 1, number 2, an agreement concerning inherited landed property of the Petra family in several places, also of Palestina Prima from the year 528. In addition to trade, the route between the Red Sea and the northern part of Syria, Palestina, leading to the northern Mediterranean and to the Black Sea, was still also an important military route, the Via Nova Traiana, and it still served as a pilgrim's route to the south, to the holy places of Palestine and the Sinai as well. Together with Christianization, the Nabateans finally accepted the Greek language and as their primary official language. That's why our documents were written in Greek. A smaller sensation was that many of the toponyms, the names of the villages around the city, were in fact Arabic-speaking tribes, were in fact Arabic names written in Greek letters. It means that the Arabic-speaking tribes were in that area already in the pre-Islamic period, at latest in the beginning of the 6th century, more than 100 years before Prophet Muhammad. From these texts, we can see how the Greek-speaking people heard and spelt the Arabic names, otherwise preserved only in the Arabic script containing only the consonants without vowels. With the complete opening and conservation of some 140 fragmentary scrolls by Finnish team, and with the initial reading of all the documents by the teams from the University of Helsinki and the University of Michigan, scholars assumed that this single largest collection of written material from ancient Jordan would clarify many aspects of the Byzantine society and economy as a whole. The final analysis is still underway. Anyhow, the publication phase of the work has now been finished. The first volume of the Petra Papyri appeared in 2002, the third volume in 2007, the fourth volume in 2011, and the second volume came out in 2013. From the 140 scrolls or fragments of rolls that have been opened, more than 20 yield partially continuous text segments of several meters long, and about another 20 provide us with fragments with substantial information. Now, the volume 5 finalizes the publication project. This volume contains also the edition of the Petra Papyri, papyrus number 55, inventory number 6A. The scrolls mention, for example, several churches and other public buildings, among them the house of our Lord, the Saint High Priest Aaron, outside of the city of Petra in P. Petra 55. It is mentioned as one of the two beneficiaries in case of the death of the sick man, Mr. Obodianos, in his last will, or properly his donatio propter mortem, partially written in Latin. This papyrus was the starting point of our way to the top, actually to the top of Mount Aaron. The mountain of Aaron, Jebel Haroun, is situated some 5 kilometers as the crow flies to the southwest of the city center of Petra. According to the prevalent tradition based on the Jewish historiographer Flavius Josephus in the late 1st century AD, and stated also by, for example, the church father Eusebius, bishop of Caesarea, in the first half of the 4th century, the highest mountain of the Petra region, the mountain of Aaron, within sight of the city, is in fact the biblical Mount Hor. Literally, the mountain on top of the mountain. The burial place of Aaron, the elder brother of Moses. An Islamic shrine, the Weli, was built there only after the Crusader period, during the first half of the 14th century, by the Mamluk Sultan Nasir ibn Kalaun. It was built over the remains of an earlier Christian church on the top of the mountain. A complex of collapsed buildings on a high plateau 70 meters below the summit was probably the monastery of Saint Aaron, mentioned several times in our historical sources. Starting from the 6th century, it was built over the remains of an earlier Nabatean cultic complex. But why was it called the House of Aaron in our papyrus, in the last will of Obodianos? Indeed, because of the terms hagios oikos in Greek and domus in Latin of the Petra Papyrus, and because of the title of its representative, the presbyteros kai hegumenos, priest and superior, the papyrus almost certainly refers to a monastic complex of Saint High Priest Aaron, which could be identified with the remains on the high plateau of Jebel Haroun. In that case, the papyrus, most probably from AD 573, is the earliest historical source referring to that monastery. But why the house and not the church or the chapel, not even the monastery of Aaron? There were no written sources available for answering this question. The only way to gain an explanation was archaeological excavations. Now, the archaeologists said that's a mission impossible. Not so much as regards the excavation techniques, but because of the catering up on the top of the mountain, where you have to bring everything on donkey back, starting with all the water needed. Since then, 1997, the long-term interdisciplinary excavation project, the Finnish Jebel Haroun project, aimed at a full understanding of the collapsed building complex, of the topography and history of the mountain and its immediate agricultural surroundings, as well as its relations to the city of Petra. So far, the personnel of the Finnish Jebel Haroun project conducted an archaeological reconnaissance in 1997 and 8 full excavation seasons at the site, staying and living in 2 large Bedouin tents with all the high-tech equipment and Finnish solar panels, which produce the energy, the electricity needed for the laptops and email contacts. There were 20 donkeys bringing the daily food and other supply needed, and a network of Bedouins as workmen and suppliers of the catering. During the first full season in 1998, a small chapel was excavated and cleared. In front of the altar, a small marble fragment was found with only 4 letters, Alpha, Rho, Omega, and Nu, and the end of one line, at the end of one line. That was enough to tell us that we were working on the right place. But the chapel is not a house of Aaron. Therefore, we continued with the adjacent large building, a basilican church. In its original phase, the phase 2, it was quite large, like the bishop's church in the city center of Petra, mentioned in our papyrus, and mentioned as the Church of Virgin Mary, where the carbonized papyri were found. But the church is not a house. That's why we continued. We continued with rooms of a small monastery, which is not a house either. And finally with rooms of a hostel, circa 20 square meters each. Well, in fact, the whole building complex is a pilgrimage center with a hostel for VIPs, used also as a hospital of Justinian, using as a hospital during the pandemic diseases like the bubonic plague at the time of Justinian. And so we got the answer for the question raised by the Petra Papyri. There is no technical term in Greek language for that kind of building complex as a pilgrimage center. It really is just the house of the Saint High Priest Aaron. On this wall, close to the former entrance to the hostel, we found a building inscription on the tabula ansata commemorating a donation by a certain Obodianos, made together with a certain Panolobios. Maybe our Obodianos with his nephew or first cousin. His first cousin, who is also well known from the Petra Papyri. We know that Panolobios died before 592, which accordingly is the terminus antequem for his donation, but not for the inscription, which might be later. Anyhow, was a stroke of luck, one might say. In the Petra Papyrus 55, dictated by Obodianos, son of Obodianos, the last will has been preserved as written 6 times in 6 columns, 1 to each beneficiary. All the 6 copies are still in the same scroll. They were not cut apart and distributed to the beneficiaries. It means that Obodianos did not die because of that disease, the so-called Justinianic plague. He recovered. And the last will, the donation propter mortem, was not executed. Anyhow, later, or maybe already earlier, unfortunately, the inscription does not give any date, he most probably gave a donation to the house of Aaron, and this time together with his nephew or first cousin Panolobios, son of Theodoros, son of Obodianos, who, Theodoros, is the main figure in our carbonized Petra Papyrus archive. The pilgrimage center of Aaron belongs to a series of similar building complexes in Transjordan, starting with the Monastery of Moses on Mount Nebo and continuing to the south with the Monastery of Lot on the eastern shore of the Dead Sea. Then we have Mount Aaron in Petra, and finally on Sinai, the Monastery of Moses, or the Monastery of Transfiguration, later called St. Catherine's. St. Catherine's is still partly preserved, especially the church in the same shape as it was built already in the 6th century. Now we have planned the final site conservation on Jebel Haroun, including the building of a shelter for the church and its mosaics, and for the chapel, which also will house a small museum. The first volume of our publication, The Church and the Chapel, appeared in 2008, and the third volume, The Archaeological Survey, in 2013. The second and final volume, The Nabatean Cultic Complex and the Byzantine Monastery, appeared in 2016. If you know some mission impossible, please don't tell us, at least not before the end of next year. We still have our hands full. Thank you for your attention.
Okay, we'll start with a place where the papyri were found, which is a small room next to the main church, the Church of Virgin Mary in Petra. The place, of course, has some bearing on our interpretation of the archive. No more on the conservation. Again, you have heard already about that. I'll just add that in the 1990s, there were so many Finnish scholars working on the conservation in ACOR that some people started to call this not ACOR, but FAKER. Of course, we are very proud of that. But let's now go to the contents of the papyri. What do they tell us? What is their significance? And it's best to start with this map. As most of you probably know, the by far largest number of everyday documents from the Roman Empire and the ancient world come from Egypt, where the dry sand has preserved so many papyri. According to a recent estimate, there have been about 60,000 documents published so far from Egypt, and another 1 million are waiting to be published. In contrast, from all the rest of the Roman Empire, there is very little similar. From late antiquity, there are only the documents preserved in the church archive of Ravenna in Italy, a small group of wooden tablets from North Africa, the so-called Tablet Albertini. Both these are in Latin. And then there are the Nessana papyri, actually quite near Petra, and they are in Greek. They are from the 6th and 7th centuries. And now there are the Petra Papyri, a very sizable group of Greek documents. So this map alone shows us what is the significance of this find. So who are the people who appear in the papyri? Very clearly, the main figure in this archive is a man called Theodoros, son of Obodianos. He was clearly the owner of this archive for most of its life existence. Whether he was the last owner is not quite clear. Theodoros was born around 513. In 537, he married his second cousin, Stephanus. Then he was around 24 years of age. He became a deacon of the Church of St. Mary sometime between 549 and 559. At that time, he was aged between 35 and 47. He became archdeacon by 574. And we know that he was still alive during the reign of Emperor Maurice. So that means at least the beginning of the 580s. He owned land not only in Petra, but also in the nearby garrison town of Castron Zadakaton, modern-day Sadaka, and in Gaza. So his family clearly had connections in many places in the area. Here you already saw the family tree of Theodoros as we have been able to reconstruct it. We don't need to go into details and individuals, you just see what we have been able to reconstruct. His wife, Stephanus, must have been in her teens when they were married. Her age is not given, but as we know that her father, so Theodoros' father-in-law, Patrophilos, was still alive in the 580s. So he can't have been born much before 500 AD. So that means that his daughter can't have been more than, say, 15, 20 years at the time of her marriage. She might have been even younger. We can't establish that. Theodoros had at least one son, Panolbios, whom Jaakko already mentioned. It's not quite clear he's the same Panolbios. This is not a very rare name. But we know that Panolbios died before Theodoros. The exact year is not known. These people were clearly well off. The best sign of the relative social and economic position is the value of the property which Stephanus brought into her marriage as dowry and as other property over and above the dowry. It was about 6.5 pounds of gold, making 468 solidi, which was the main currency of the time. So this can be compared with the annual wage of a simple worker at that time, which was only a few solidi. And on the other hand, we know that the richest senators in the Eastern Empire gave dowries which were valued as high as 100 pounds of gold. And the Western senators were even richer. So it's clear that Theodoros and his family were not among they are not, say, part of the imperial elite or not even the regional elite, but by local standards, they were well off. Now we could have a look at the types of documents found in the archive. The area which produced quite a lot of papyrus work in Petra was taxation, quite as today. So there are tax receipts, tax declarations, requests for the transfer of taxation. About the same number of papyri are contracts between private people. So they were selling land, slaves, houses, making wills, dividing estates, settling debts, and so on. There are few fragments of letters, some fragments of lists or accounts, but not very much can be said of them. And then there is a number of donations for pious purposes and other ecclesiastical documents. And these were not part of Theodoros' private papers, but they were linked to his office in the church. So he used this as he worked for the church. There are also some contracts and tax receipts which don't seem to have any link to Theodoros himself, but to other private people. It may be that these people were part of his family, although we can't recognize the link between them and Theodoros. It's also possible that when he bought some land, he also got some documents which were linked to the land, so previous transactions on the same land. But the documents are so fragmentary that often we can't say anything for sure. The first certainly dated document is from 537. There is one document which is very probably from 528, 29, and some of the undated documents can be even earlier. The last dated documents are from the 590s. So at that time, Theodoros would have been in his 80s. He's not mentioned in the last documents. So we don't know if he was alive. He could have been alive. If he was not alive, the question is who used this archive after his death. As the place where they were located, a room which was clearly part of the ecclesiastical complex, it's rather unlikely that his family could have used that room after his death. So it's possible that they were just left and forgotten there after his death, or he might have been alive. We don't know when the church was burnt and collapsed. There's a reasonable hypothesis that it was burnt around 600, because it's so unlikely that they could have used this room only for preserving the papyri of a dead man for many years, or for even a generation. The reason why the church was destroyed is not known. It might have been linked with the Persian War in the early 7th century, but it's probably or more likely that it was burnt a bit earlier, so around 600. Other people in the papyri are not always easy to identify because there were so many individuals who had the same name. So there are at least 8 men in the archive who are called Valens, 7 called Theodoros, 5 Leontioi, 4 Alpheioi, 4 called John, and 4 to 6 who are called Obodianos. The case of Gesios is interesting because Stephanos of Byzantium, who wrote a treatise in the 6th century, it was a geographic and ethnographic treatise, he said that the name Gesios is very typical of Petra, and so it seems to be. Sometimes these people can be identified through their handwriting if they signed the documents themselves. But even this is not quite compelling because we see that Theodoros himself, for most of his life, signed his documents with 2 different styles of handwriting. We don't know why he changed the handwriting, but he used them kind of simultaneously. Sometimes patronymics tell us that the people are different, so their father's name. But in any case, there are at least 100 males who are different, are participants or witnesses in the documents. Some 50 people may be different persons, and then another 50 males appear only as patronymics. But most of these remain just names for us. We don't know anything more about them. Women are a minority, and I'll come back to women very soon. Byzantine emperors and consuls are routinely mentioned in the dating formulas, but if we omit these rather simple cases, there is only one person who is known from other historical sources, and this is Abu Karib ibn Jabala, a local Ghassanid leader who was allied with the Byzantines and from the Emperor Justinian received the title of Phylarch. He is mentioned in one of the papyri as an arbiter in the quarrel which Theodoros had with a neighbor of his. Theodoros also once received a short letter or notice from a man who had a very long and lofty name, Flavius Marianos Ioannes Sergios Narses Sumos Partianos Megethios. Very probably he was the governor of the province of the Third Palestine, but we don't have the registers of the governors of the province, so we can't identify him anywhere else. Women, they are a minority. As a background, we should remember that in the Roman Empire, including the Byzantine period of the 6th century, women did inherit a lot of property. In many cases, almost as much as men, and they could use that property independently of their husband if they so wanted. So that was guaranteed by the imperial law. How independent they actually were must have depended on perhaps local circumstances and perhaps even more by personal circumstances. Stephanos, Theodoros' bride, in the marriage documents between his husband and his father, Stephanos is just an object. So she's not a part of these contracts. But we have to remember that these were the property contracts. Who will get the dowry, who will get other property, and Stephanos was in her teens, so almost a child at that time. There is another bride in the archive. She's called Kyra, and she is a part in the contract. So she's making the contract together with his groom, his future husband, and she seems to be a widow already, so she has a child from a previous marriage. There are two other widows, Elaphia and Hyperechia. Elaphia is not representing only herself, but also her 3 underage children as their guardian. And Hyperechia is renting out a vineyard, which she seems to have inherited from her husband. While Arista, her wife, is in that document represented by her husband. It seems that she owned the property, but her husband represented her in the contract. So this seems to give the impression that in Petra, people follow the rather universal historical model where wives were more or less dependent on their husbands, but widows then were more independent. But the material is not very big, as you can see. All those women, when they signed the documents, they used a proxy, so someone to write for them, because they couldn't write themselves. So of course, most men as well in Petra were illiterate, but even in these circles where Theodoros moved, where men could write, it seems that it was more rare for women. Some soldiers are in the picture. So they are found in the papyri. They were part of the everyday life in Petra and in the surroundings. They were not simple rank and file, but officers of some sort. 2 of them were writing documents for civilians who could not write themselves. One was renting a vineyard. One was marrying a local woman. So it seems that the Byzantine border troops were more or less integrated by now in the civilian population of the region. Most of them are said to be from the garrison in Sadaka. There must have been a garrison in Petra itself, but it's never mentioned in the papyri. There is a curious title which appears in the marriage document. The soldier who is marrying is called with the rank of Batmos. It must have been a military rank of some sort. And oddly enough, it is mentioned also in one of the Nessana papyri, but nowhere else in the Eastern Empire. So it never appears in Egyptian papyri, not in historical sources, not in the Byzantine military handbooks. So it must be a word which was used only in Palestine. But why it was so, we can't know. The church. After the Church Council of Chalcedon in 451, Petra was moved from under Bostra and Antioch to be a metropolis of its own under the Patriarchate of Jerusalem. Some bishops of Petra are known from historical sources, but we can't connect them with the people appearing in the papyri. There are a few bishops in our papyri, and at least one of them is a bishop of Petra, but he can't be linked with those we know from other sources. Otherwise, there are almost 30 churchmen in our papyri, which of course is a rather large proportion of all males appearing in this dossier, and it must reflect the circles where Theodoros himself was moving. One of the priests could write his own name with only much difficulty. So it shows that priests at that time were recruited from rather large population groups, so not only from the upper and middle classes. On the other hand, the priests owned land, houses, and slaves, quite as the lay people of the period. They were married, they had children. The cleric was not required to divorce when she entered the church. If they were married, they could stay married. They were only forbidden to enter a marriage after they had joined the church. And the churchmen also quarreled between themselves. So Theodoros himself had a very long quarrel with a neighbor of his in Sadaka, who was a churchman too, a deacon. And there is one papyrus where a priest is accusing another churchman of stealing some property from his house. Trade, in the modern sense, does not appear in our papyri. It doesn't mean that there was no trade in Petra, just that the people with whom Theodoros had contacts, they were landowners, not tradesmen. People in Petra owned quite a lot of land, both in Sadaka and also in the nearby town of Augustopolis, modern Udru. There is one very curious feature of the registration of property in Petra, which we don't know from Egypt at all. When people sold land to each other in Petra, it could take years that they didn't register the transaction with the tax officials. So that means that the old owner continued to pay the taxes for the city, and the new owner paid to the old owner. And this could take a year, several years, and perhaps 20 years. And then at last they declared the transaction to the tax officials, and then the new owner started to pay the taxes directly to the city. Why was that? No idea. We can't find any logic in this. Strictly taken, this was forbidden in imperial law. You should register the transaction at once. But when they did the registration after, say, 10 years, they didn't try to conceal it anyway. In the declaration, they quite clearly said that I bought this land 10 years ago, and now I'm registering. But the reason escapes us. It seems that landowning in Petra was not concentrated at all in this period. We have one very long papyrus where three brothers are dividing an estate which they have inherited from some relative of theirs, perhaps a grandfather, grandmother. The size of this estate seems to have been some 20 to 30 hectares. But it consisted of about 90 small pieces of land, separate pieces of land, each of them only fractions of hectares, not more than 1/2 of a hectare. So the reason for keeping the property in such small parcels may have been partly to diminish the risk of bad harvest, because the climate was so risky in this area. Another reason may have been the inheritance, so that from generation to generation, the parcels were divided into smaller and smaller pieces, and then they were kind of, again, connected into larger areas, but not continuously, but still in these small pieces. Houses as well could be divided into very small pieces. So when these three brothers were dividing houses, which they had inherited, one house could be divided into 3 parts. Say one brother got 3 rooms, another got 2 rooms, and they had to build new entrances and close old entrances to make this practical. This habit is known from Egypt as well. The third important type of property were slaves. We don't know the number of slaves in Petra or how important they were for the economy, but it may be symptomatic that with this landed estate which the 3 brothers inherited, it included only 4 slaves, and there were 2 couples informally married between themselves. So it doesn't seem that the slaves were very important for agriculture in this area. There are some slave names from Petra. They are interesting because we don't know much about slavery in late antiquity, and very few slave names from the whole late Roman period. But these slaves appear in the papyri only as property, which is divided or inherited, and their life or circumstances, functions are not described in the papyri. A very important question in ancient studies has been the applicability of the Egyptian papyri for the rest of the Roman world. So the question of the Sonderstellung of Egypt. So was Egypt so different from all the other provinces in the Roman Empire that we can't use the Egyptian evidence for reconstructing the Roman or, say, Eastern Mediterranean society? Now that we have the Petra Papyri, we can make some estimate of how different was Egypt from the rest of the Eastern Empire. There are some laws of Justinian which we see were immediately adopted in Petra. For example, a law from 31st August 537, which said that the imperial regnal year must be used in dating all documents in the empire. So we have one Petra document from before that. In May 537, there is no regnal year, but the next document after this law, there is the regnal year. In Egypt, it took years and sometimes a decade or 2 decades before this say, legal innovation was adopted in all places. And in Italy, it took even longer. Similarly, there is a law which established the use of witnesses in contracts. The law was made in 538, and in Petra, it was used from 539. There are some juridic terms which are found in Roman law sources, and they are found in Petra, but not in Egypt. So we can at least say that the scribes in Petra were very much aware of the requirements of Roman law. A couple of rather nice examples. There is the regnal formula used in Petra. Justinianutu Aioniu kai autokratoros Augustu. Justinian, the eternal, and Emperor Augustus. This was used in Petra. Now the problem is that this was wrong. The correct form was Justinian, the eternal, Augustus, and Emperor. And this was used in Egypt and everywhere else in the Eastern Empire. So at some point, the word Augustus had been moved to a wrong place. It's syntactically wrong and odd. Now, what is curious is, yes, here is a map showing that this form was used in Petra, but also in Gaza and in Nessana, and for many decades, although it was clearly just a slip of pen, you could say. And here's the provincial boundary. So Petra and Nessana belong to the third Palestine, but Gaza to the first Palestine. So wherever this error occurred in its long way from the scribes in Constantinople to the local scribes in Petra. It took place above the provincial level, somewhere between Constantinople and Palestine. Another formula, which is the formula with which the notaries undersigned the contracts. In Petra, in Rhinocolura, which is the first Egyptian town just after the border of Palestine and Egypt, and in Alexandria, the formula goes Alpheios symbolai graphos et telesa. Alpheios notary, I wrote this. While in the whole rest of Egypt, Middle and Southern Egypt, there is another formula which is just the same thing but said in passive form. So this difference in the pattern books does not follow provincial boundaries, but some other logic which we can't reconstruct any longer. It's also interesting that the rolls found in Petra are very long. The two longest papyrus rolls found in late antiquity are both from Petra. They are 8.5 meters from Gaza and 6.4 meters from Petra. And there are many others which are over 3 meters long. And some long documents from Nessana as well. While in Egypt, where, as I said, there are tens of thousands of papyri published, there are only 4 papyri which are over 3 meters long. So this must have been somehow typical of Palestine, but why, we don't know. There were some natural catastrophes taking place in the Eastern Mediterranean during the time which is covered by our papyri. There was the dark cloud which covered the sky for about 18 months in 536, 537. It must have been caused by a northern volcano erupting somewhere, an unknown volcano. Then there was the plague of the 540s and the earthquake of 551. And of course, we wouldn't expect such things to be directly mentioned in documents of this kind. But at least we can say that the earthquake of 551 did not destroy Petra. It may not have had much influence east of the Wadi Araba in the first place. There is very little traces of such consequences. So we know that the administration of Petra worked at least up to the end of the 6th century. The wars against Persia and the Muslim conquest were still waiting Petra. If we are looking for just one thing, one natural catastrophe which may have destroyed Petra, then the best guess is the earthquake of 749, which destroyed Jerash and many other places. But that's something our papyri, of course, can't tell. Now, to conclude, the documents from Petra are extremely significant because they can tell us something about the differences between Egypt and Palestine. In many cases, there are small differences in the pattern books. Petra was somehow closer to Constantinople than Egypt. And we can't explain this by just geographical distance. The geographical distance was not that big. But by and large, it seems that the administration in Palestine and Egypt followed the same lines. There were same kinds of pattern books used by the scribes. And in fact, this is quite nice, because if the practices had been totally different in Palestine and Egypt, this would have meant that the whole vast amount of Egyptian material would have become totally useless for the study of the ancient world as a whole. So even if the publication of the Petra Papyri is of immense value for the history of Petra and the history of the southern Transjordan, so for the history of the Eastern Mediterranean, our most important contribution is the fact that we didn't find anything revolutionary. So, thank you.